The stars looked different now. Commander Jake Sullivan stood on the bridge of his damaged ship and watched Earth burn below. 3 months ago, humanity thought they were alone in the universe. 3 weeks ago, they learned the truth. 3 days ago, the war ended. The aliens called themselves the Cravathi. They came in ships that made human technology look like stone tools. They did not ask questions. They did not offer chances to surrender. They simply appeared in orbit around Earth and began destroying military bases. When humanity fought back, the Cravathi destroyed cities. When humanity begged for mercy, the Cravathi destroyed more cities. The message was clear: submit or die. Jake had commanded Earth's defense fleet. 12 ships against a Cravathi armada of over 300. The battle lasted 6 hours. 11 of Jake's ships were destroyed. His own ship barely escaped. He watched his friends die. He watched their ships explode in bright flashes that looked almost beautiful against the darkness of space. He ordered retreat when there was nothing left to fight with. Now he stood on the Cravathi flagship as a defeated man. The alien emperor, Korvax, towered over the human delegation. He had 4 arms, each ending in sharp claws. His skin was covered in dark scales that seemed to absorb light. His eyes were yellow and cold. He spoke through a device that translated his words into English. The terms were simple. Earth would become part of the Cravathi Empire. Humans would work for the Empire. They would mine resources on their planets and moons. They would build ships for the Cravathi fleet. They would obey all orders without question. Any resistance would result in complete destruction. The Emperor made it clear that Earth was not special. The Cravathi had conquered 300 star systems. They knew how to break a species that refused to submit. Jake nodded along to these terms. He expected slavery. He expected cruelty. He was a military man. He understood that losing a war meant accepting terrible conditions. But then the Emperor mentioned one more requirement. This requirement made Jake's blood turn cold. Every conquered species must honor the ancient tradition. They must offer a child to Velrax, the great dragon. The child would be presented in a ceremony on the throne world. The dragon would consume the offering. This ritual showed that the species accepted their place in the empire. It showed that they understood the Cravathi were their masters. No species had ever refused. Those who hesitated were destroyed from orbit. The Emperor activated a holographic display. Images filled the air around Jake. He saw recordings from hundreds of ceremonies. Children from different species, all dressed in white robes, all walking toward an enormous creature. The dragon was massive beyond belief. Its scales glowed with strange light. Its teeth were longer than a grown man. Its eyes burned with ancient power. And in every recording, the dragon opened its mouth and consumed the child while crowds of aliens watched. Jake felt sick. He wanted to scream. He wanted to attack the Emperor with his bare hands, even though it would accomplish nothing. He wanted to refuse, to tell these monsters that humanity would never participate in such evil. But he looked at the burned planet below and knew he had no choice. 7 billion people still lived on Earth. 2 billion more were scattered across Mars and the outer colonies. He could not condemn all of them to death. The Emperor gave humanity 30 days to choose a child and prepare for the journey to the throne world. Then the Cravathi fleet left Earth's orbit, leaving behind only a few ships to monitor for any signs of rebellion. Jake returned to Earth and reported to President Amy Clark. She listened to the terms with a face that grew paler with each word. When he finished, she sat in silence for a long time. Finally, she called an emergency meeting of every surviving government leader, every military commander, every scientist who might have insight into the situation. The meeting lasted 3 days. People shouted at each other. Some demanded that humanity refuse on principle. Better to die with dignity than live with shame. Others argued that survival was more important than pride. 7 billion lives could not be sacrificed for principles. Some suggested trying to fight again, to build new weapons, to find some weakness in Cravathi technology. But the scientists shook their heads. Earth had nothing that could challenge the aliens. Even if humans spent 100 years developing new weapons, the Cravathi would simply destroy them from orbit. Dr. Lisa Harper, a scientist who studied alien biology, suggested sending an adult volunteer instead of a child. Perhaps the dragon would accept someone who understood the sacrifice. But the Cravathi had been very clear. It must be a child. The innocence was important to the ritual. Any substitution would be rejected. Time ran out. The council voted. The decision was so close that it came down to a single vote. They would comply. They would send a child. President Clark would not tell anyone how she voted. She simply announced the decision and then locked herself in her office for 6 hours. The next terrible question was how to choose. How could anyone decide which child should die? Some suggested a lottery, but that felt too random and cruel. Others wanted volunteers, but what parent could offer their child for such a fate? And what child could truly understand what they were volunteering for? A committee was formed. They spent sleepless nights reviewing options. In the end, they chose a girl named Katie Morgan. She was 7 years old. She had brown hair and brown eyes. She liked to draw pictures of flowers. She had lost her parents when Los Angeles was bombed in the first wave of the invasion. She lived in a refugee center now, cared for by overwhelmed workers who tried their best, but could not give individual attention to thousands of orphaned children. The committee told themselves that Katie had no family left, no parents to grieve for her, no siblings to miss her. This made the choice easier, they said, though none of them could sleep afterward. The truth was simpler and more horrible. They chose Katie because she was alone in the world, and there would be fewer people to object. Dr. Paul Chen, a child psychologist, was given the task of preparing Katie. He went to the refugee center and found her sitting in a corner, drawing with broken crayons on scraps of paper. She looked up at him with eyes that had already seen too much suffering for someone so young. Paul knelt down beside her. He spoke gently. He told her that she had been chosen for a very special journey. She would travel to another planet and meet a very important creature. She would need to be brave. Katie listened with the quiet acceptance of a child who had learned that adults controlled everything and arguing never helped. She asked if she could bring her drawings. Paul said yes. Jake volunteered to escort Katie to the throne world. He told himself it was the least he could do, though he knew nothing would wash away the guilt of what they were doing. President Clark approved his request. Perhaps she thought Jake deserved to witness the consequences of their surrender, or perhaps she simply could not find anyone else willing to take a child to her death. The Cravathi sent a transport ship to Earth. It was huge and dark, covered in armor plating that made it look more like a weapon than a vehicle. Jake and Katie boarded with a small delegation of human observers who would witness the ceremony and report back to Earth. The ship lifted off, leaving Earth behind. Katie pressed her face against a window, watching her home planet shrink until it was just another point of light among many. The journey would take 3 weeks. The ship traveled faster than any human vessel, bending space in ways that Earth scientists did not understand. Jake spent those weeks trying to make Katie comfortable. He taught her card games. He told her stories about space exploration. He answered her endless questions about the stars and planets they passed. Katie seemed surprisingly calm. She did not cry or ask to go home. She accepted her situation with a maturity that broke Jake's heart. Sometimes she would get quiet and distant, staring at nothing. Jake recognized that look. He had seen it on soldiers who had experienced too much trauma. A 7-year-old child should not have that look in her eyes. On the 10th day of the journey, Katie asked Jake where they were really going. He had tried to keep the truth vague, but she was smarter than he gave her credit for. She could sense the sadness in the adults around her. She knew something bad was waiting at the end of this trip. Jake knelt down to her level. He looked into her brown eyes and told her as much truth as he could bear to speak. They were going to meet Velrax, who was very big and very powerful. The meeting would be dangerous. She would need to be the bravest girl in the universe. Katie thought about this for a moment. Then she asked if it would hurt. Jake lied and said no. She nodded, accepting his answer, though something in her expression suggested she knew he was not telling the whole truth. On the 20th day, the ship arrived at the throne world. The planet was called Carthax. It was larger than Earth, with 3 moons and a ring system that sparkled like diamonds. The capital city covered an entire continent. Towers reached into the clouds. Streets were wide enough to march armies down. At the center of everything stood the Imperial Citadel, a structure so massive it created its own weather patterns. The ship landed in a designated area outside the Citadel. Jake and Katie were escorted by Cravathi guards through corridors filled with representatives from dozens of conquered species. Aliens of every shape. The dragon did not move forward. It did not open its mouth. It simply stared at Katie with eyes that glowed like captured stars. The entire chamber fell silent except for the sound of Velrax breathing. Each breath moved enough air to create wind that stirred Katie's white robes. Katie stared back. She should have been terrified. Every other species that stood in this position felt terror so complete it paralyzed them. But Katie had already lost everything. Her parents were dead. Her home was destroyed. Her world was conquered. She had nothing left to lose, and sometimes when you have nothing left to lose, fear becomes something else, something quieter and stronger. She looked at the dragon and thought about her mother. Before the invasion, her mother used to take her to the zoo. Katie remembered standing in front of the tiger enclosure, watching the big cat pace back and forth. Her mother explained that the tiger was not happy in its cage. It wanted to be free, to run and hunt, to be what it was meant to be. Katie had felt sad for the tiger then. Now she looked at Velrax and saw the same thing. A creature in a cage. The cage was not made of bars, but of something else. Something invisible, but just as strong. The dragon's eyes held an expression she recognized. It was the same look she saw in the mirror every morning. The look of someone who had given up hope. Katie did not kneel. She did not bow her head. Instead, she took a step forward. Then another. The Cravathi guards at the entrance stirred nervously. This was not protocol. The offering was supposed to wait for the dragon to approach. But Katie kept walking until she was close enough to reach out and touch the dragon's scales. She extended one small hand. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she did not pull back. She touched Velrax's scales, right where the snout met the massive head. The scales felt warm and smooth, like polished stone that had been sitting in the sun. Light exploded from the point of contact. Blue light, soft and gentle, spread across the dragon's body in waves. The entire chamber filled with a glow that made everyone shield their eyes. The light was different from the harsh energy that usually emanated from Velrax. This light felt warm. It felt alive. It felt like hope. Jake watched from the entrance, his heart hammering so hard he thought his chest would burst. The Cravathi court erupted in confusion. Guards moved forward, weapons charging. Emperor Korvax stood from his throne, his 4 arms spread wide. He barked orders in his native language. The translator in Jake's ear rendered the words into English. The Emperor was demanding to know what was happening. Velrax made a sound that no recording in the Imperial archives had ever captured. It was almost like a purr, a deep vibration that shook dust from the ancient rafters. The dragon's enormous head moved closer to Katie. For a terrible moment, Jake thought this was when the consumption would finally happen. His hand went to his sidearm, even though he knew a pistol would be useless against a creature that could shrug off starship weapons. But Velrax did not consume Katie. The dragon nuzzled her with the side of its massive snout. Gentle as a cat with a kitten. The blue light grew brighter. Katie laughed. It was a sound of pure joy, completely unexpected in this place of death and terror. She wrapped her small arms around as much of the dragon's snout as she could reach, hugging it like she used to hug her father. Something was happening inside Velrax's mind. Memories were surfacing. Memories that had been buried under 10,000 years of pain and conditioning. The dragon remembered a time before the Cravathi, before the cage, before the endless parade of frightened children. It remembered companions who were not food but friends. It remembered a species that valued compassion and creativity, who saw dragons not as weapons but as partners. Those companions were long gone, destroyed by the same dimensional rifts that trapped Velrax in this reality. For 10 millennia, the dragon had been alone. It had forgotten what connection felt like. It had forgotten that anything existed beyond hunger and obedience and the taste of innocence forced down its throat against its will. But Katie's touch triggered something in the dragon's ancient genetics. Humans possessed a unique combination of traits. They could think logically while feeling deeply. They could create beauty while also creating weapons. They were contradictions wrapped in flesh, and their neural patterns created signals that matched the extinct companions Velrax remembered. Not perfectly, but close enough. Close enough to wake the dragon from its 10,000-year nightmare. Emperor Korvax descended from his platform. His scales seemed darker than before, as if shadows clung to him. He approached the dragon and the girl, moving with the confidence of someone who had never been defied. He spoke in his native tongue, his voice carrying across the chamber even without amplification. The translator rendered his words. He commanded Velrax to complete the ritual. He reminded the dragon of its place and purpose. The beast had served the Empire for countless generations. It would continue to serve. This display was entertaining but meaningless. The offering would be consumed now, or there would be consequences that made previous punishments seem gentle. Velrax turned its enormous head toward the Emperor. For the first time since its capture, the dragon looked at its captors not with dull acceptance, but with full awareness. The courtiers took an involuntary step back. They had lived their entire lives believing Velrax was merely a powerful beast, a weapon to be aimed at enemies. They were beginning to realize they had been very wrong. The dragon's mouth opened. But instead of roaring or consuming Katie, it spoke. The language was ancient, predating the Cravathi Empire by eons. The translator system struggled to render the meaning. The words came through broken and distorted, but their message was clear enough. No more offerings. The chamber erupted in chaos. Guards shouted into communication devices. Courtiers backed away from the dragon. Emperor Korvac stood frozen for a moment, his yellow eyes wide. Then his expression hardened. He had not built an empire by accepting defiance. He raised one clawed hand and made a sharp gesture. Weapons powered up all around the chamber. Energy cannons that could vaporize starships. Kinetic accelerators that could punch through armor plating. Plasma throwers that could melt solid steel. All of them aimed at the small human child standing at the dragon's feet. If Velrax would not consume the offering, then the Cravathi would kill it by other means. The ritual must be completed one way or another. Velrax's wings unfurled. They had been folded against the dragon's body for so long that everyone had forgotten they existed. Now they spread wide, each one large enough to cast entire cities in shadow. The scales across the dragon's body began to glow. But this was different from the absorbed energy they usually displayed. This light came from within, from a power source that had been dormant for millennia. The wings wrapped around Katie like a protective cocoon just as the guards fired. Energy weapons splashed harmlessly against the dragon's scales. Kinetic rounds bounced off like raindrops. Plasma washed over the wings and left no mark. The entire arsenal of the Cravathi Empire's most advanced military technology proved completely inadequate against Velrax when the dragon was actually trying to defend something. Inside the cocoon of wings, Katie felt the impacts but was not hurt. The dragon's wings were like walls of living armor. She could hear the weapons firing, could feel Velrax's body shaking slightly with each impact, but nothing reached her. She felt safer than she had since the day her parents died. Jake watched from the entrance, torn between hope and horror. Katie was alive, protected by the very creature meant to kill her, but they were trapped in the heart of an empire that had just watched its ultimate weapon refuse orders. Even if they survived the next few minutes, what then? The Cravathi would never let this insult stand. Emperor Korvac raised his hand again, signaling a ceasefire. The weapons powered down. The chamber fell silent except for the dragon's breathing and the soft sound of Katie crying inside the protective wings. The Emperor studied the situation with calculating eyes. His species had not built an empire spanning 300 systems through brute force alone. They knew when to attack and when to reassess. He addressed Velrax directly, his tone shifting from command to something that almost resembled negotiation. He spoke of the countless species depending on the empire for order and structure. He reminded the dragon that chaos and war would consume the galaxy without the strong hand of Cravathi rule. The ritual, distasteful as it might be, served a greater purpose. It maintained fear, and fear maintained peace. Surely Velrax understood this. The dragon's response came not in words but in action. Velrax's mind, freed from the psychological chains that had bound it for 10,000 years, reached out across the chamber. It touched the consciousness of every being present. In an instant, they all experienced what the dragon had experienced: 10,000 years of forced consumption. 10,000 years of tasting fear and innocence. 10,000 years of being made into a monster against its will. Memories of children from countless species. All of them terrified, all of them innocent, all of them dying in the dragon's mouth while crowds watched and cheered. The weight of 10 millennia of unwilling cruelty crashed into every mind in the chamber. The psychic contact lasted only seconds, but it left everyone staggered. The conference chamber was smaller than the devouring chamber, but still massive by human standards. It had been designed for meetings between the Emperor and representatives from the largest species in the Empire. Now it held something unprecedented: a negotiation between conquerors and the conquered, with a dragon as mediator. Katie sat on Velrax's forearm like a child sitting on a parent's lap. The dragon refused to be separated from her even for a moment. No one was willing to try forcing the issue. Jake stood beside them as Earth's representative, still processing what he had witnessed in the devouring chamber. Emperor Korvax brought his military council and chief advisors, all of them looking shaken and uncertain. Velrax spoke first. The dragon's words came through a translation device that its mind interfaced with directly. The ancient language flowed into English with surprising clarity. Velrax explained its origins in a dimension that touched this reality only under specific conditions. It described the companions who had valued compassion and creativity above all else. It told of the dimensional rifts that destroyed those companions and trapped the dragon here. The Cravathi ancestors had found Velrax weak and disoriented from the dimensional transition. They used technology and psychic restraints to capture it. Over centuries, they conditioned the dragon to serve them, to forget its own nature, to become nothing more than a weapon and a symbol of terror. The conditioning was so complete that Velrax itself had forgotten it was a person, and not just a beast until Katie touched it and triggered memories 10,000 years old. The revelation shocked the Cravathi Council. Many of them genuinely believed Velrax was simply an animal, dangerous and powerful but ultimately mindless. Some had seen records from the early days of the Empire that suggested otherwise, but those records were ancient and easy to dismiss. Now they were confronted with the truth. Their empire had been built on the enslavement and torture of a sentient being whose power dwarfed their own. One of the Emperor's advisors, an old Cravathi named Torvex, spoke up. His voice shook with emotion that his species rarely displayed. He asked how this was possible. How could their ancestors have done such a thing? How could generations of Cravathi have maintained this system without questioning it? Jake found himself answering. He spoke about Earth's history, about systems of oppression that lasted for centuries because people inherited them and never questioned deeply enough. He talked about slavery, about genocide, about cruelties committed not by monsters but by ordinary people who convinced themselves that terrible things were necessary or natural. The Cravathi were not unique in their capacity for evil. They were just very good at it. Emperor Korvax listened in silence. His expression was difficult to read, but Jake thought he saw something like recognition there. The Emperor was beginning to understand that he was not just a ruler but a prisoner of his own system. The ritual had maintained his power, yes, but it had also trapped him in a role that required him to do terrible things without question. Katie had fallen asleep against Velrax's warm scales. The stress of the day had exhausted her. She dreamed of her mother taking her to the zoo, of watching tigers pace in their cages. In her dream, she opened all the cages and watched the animals run free. When she woke, she would not remember the dream clearly, but she would carry its feeling with her. The Emperor faced an impossible dilemma. He could attempt to destroy Velrax, but the dragon had proven that Imperial weapons were ineffective when it actually defended itself. He could try to recapture and recondition the creature, but every species in the Empire now knew the truth. The fear that maintained order was evaporating by the hour. Reports were already coming in from outer systems. Subject species were questioning their tribute payments. Some were arming themselves. Others were simply waiting to see what would happen next. The chief military advisor suggested a traditional response: destroy Velrax with overwhelming force regardless of cost. Execute the human child publicly, and bombard Earth into submission as an example. It was how the Cravathi had always dealt with challenges to their authority. Fear and force. The methods had worked for 10,000 years. Why change now? But a younger advisor named Calvex disagreed. He pointed out that the Empire was fracturing regardless of what they did now. The broadcast of the failed ceremony had been seen by trillions. The traditional methods would lead to system-wide rebellion and generations of warfare. The Empire would spend centuries fighting to maintain control, bleeding resources and lives for diminishing returns. Perhaps it was time to try something different. Jake spoke up again, surprising himself. He suggested that humans could help. Earth's history was full of empires built on cruelty that eventually transformed into something better. It was never easy. It always involved conflict and pain. But it was possible to change course, to build new foundations for power that did not require innocent deaths and ritual terror. He proposed a treaty. Humanity would share its knowledge and experience with societal transformation. Earth would provide advisors to help the Cravathi navigate the transition. In exchange, humanity would be granted autonomy within the Empire. All tribute would be reduced to voluntary trade relationships. Earth would become a partner rather than a subject. And Katie would be allowed to remain with Velrax if she chose, serving as a living symbol of the Empire's new direction. The proposal was met with silence. Several Cravathi advisors looked ready to reject it outright. The idea of treating a conquered species as equals was deeply offensive to their culture. But Emperor Korvax raised a hand, signaling them to wait. He considered the offer carefully. His eyes moved from Jake to Katie sleeping peacefully against the dragon, to Velrax watching everything with ancient wisdom. The Emperor asked what guarantees humanity could offer. How could he trust that this was not simply a delay tactic, a way to buy time until Earth could build weapons capable of challenging Cravathi power? Jake admitted honestly that there were no guarantees. Trust had to be built over time through actions, not words. But he pointed out that Earth had no real choice. The Cravathi could still destroy them if they wanted. Humanity was offering help from a position of weakness, which made the offer more credible. Velrax spoke then, adding its own perspective. The dragon wanted freedom, certainly, but it also wanted something more complex: purpose. For 10,000 years it had been a weapon. Before that, in the dimension where its kind originated, Velrax had been a guardian and teacher. Dragons bonded with individuals, helping them develop their potential and protecting them from danger. It was a relationship of mutual benefit and genuine affection. The dragon could not return to its home dimension. The rifts were permanent, and its original companions were extinct. But perhaps it could recreate something similar here with humans. Velrax wanted to travel to Earth, to study humanity and see if the connection it felt with Katie extended to her entire species. If it did, then the dragon could become what it was meant to be, not a weapon, but a partner in growth and exploration. This suggestion terrified some of the Cravathi and intrigued Jake in equal measure. A being of Velrax's power living on Earth could be humanity's greatest protector or its destruction. But Jake looked at Katie sleeping peacefully and made a leap of faith. He accepted the proposal on behalf of Earth. The risk was worth taking. Sometimes you had to trust in possibilities rather than certainties. Emperor Korvax realized he had lost control of the situation entirely. His choices had narrowed to accepting these new terms or watching his empire collapse into civil war. He chose survival. He agreed to the treaty with reservations and conditions. There would be monitoring. There would be regular reports. If Earth showed any signs of betrayal, the consequences would be immediate and total. But he would allow the experiment to proceed. The conference lasted another 6 hours as details were hammered out. Katie slept through most of it, occasionally stirring when voices got too loud. Velrax remained patient and still, though the dragon's mind was racing with possibilities. Jake negotiated with a skill he did not know he possessed, fighting for concessions that would give Earth real autonomy rather than just symbolic gestures. By the end, they had the framework of an agreement. Earth would maintain its own government and military for defense purposes only. Cravathi ships would no longer patrol the solar system except by invitation. The tribute system was abolished entirely, replaced by trade agreements that both sides could negotiate as equals. Humanity would send advisors to the throne world to assist with the Empire's transformation. But those advisors would serve in an advisory capacity only, with no authority to give orders. Most importantly, Katie would be free to choose her own path. If she wanted to remain with Velrax and travel to Earth, that was her decision. If she preferred to return to a normal life without the dragon, that would be honored too. She was not property or a symbol or a tool. She was a child who had been through trauma, and she deserved the chance to heal and grow on her own terms. When Katie finally woke, she found herself surrounded by tired adults who all looked at her with strange expressions. She rubbed her eyes and asked what happened. Jake knelt down beside her and explained as simply as he. The news reached Earth before the transport did. President Amy Clark received the transmission from Jake and spent an hour sitting alone in her office, trying to process what she had just learned. The child they sent to die was alive. The dragon that was supposed to kill her had instead bonded with her. The empire that conquered Earth was now offering a treaty, and a being powerful enough to destroy planets was coming to live on their world. She called an emergency meeting. The response from government officials ranged from joy to terror. Some saw this as humanity's greatest triumph, proof that humans possess something special that even ancient cosmic beings recognized. Others saw it as a disaster waiting to happen. A dragon that refused orders from the Cravathi would not necessarily obey humans either. What if Velrax decided Earth was not what it wanted? What if the bond with Katie broke? Dr. Lisa Harper took charge of preparing for Velrax's arrival. She assembled a team of scientists, psychologists, and military advisors. They chose a landing site in the Arizona desert, far from major cities but close enough to infrastructure. They built observation posts and established protocols for communication. They prepared for every scenario they could imagine, though they knew imagination could not fully prepare them for reality. The hardest part was managing the public response. When news of the dragon's impending arrival was announced, panic spread across the planet. Some people tried to flee to underground shelters. Others armed themselves and swore to fight if the dragon proved hostile. Religious groups interpreted Velrax's coming in dozens of different ways, from divine judgment to alien salvation. Lisa went on every major news network and explained the situation as clearly as possible. Velrax was not a conqueror. The dragon was a refugee, a being that had suffered immensely, and was seeking connection with a species that could understand it. Yes, there were risks, but there were also possibilities. Humanity had a chance to learn from a creature that had existed for eons, that had seen dimensions beyond human comprehension. They needed to approach this with hope rather than fear. Not everyone was convinced, but Lisa's calm explanations helped reduce the panic somewhat. By the time the transport entered Earth's solar system, most people had settled into a state of nervous anticipation rather than active terror. On the transport, Katie spent her days with Velrax. The dragon taught her things without formal lessons. When she touched its scales, images would flow into her mind. She saw stars being born and dying. She experienced the feeling of flying through dimensions where normal physics did not apply. She learned about the companions Velrax had known before the Cravathi captured it. The dragon's original companions had not looked anything like humans. They were beings of pure energy that sometimes took physical form and sometimes did not. But they shared something important with humanity. They valued both logic and emotion equally. They could analyze complex problems while also creating art that expressed feelings too deep for words. They were, in their own way, contradictions made manifest. Katie asked why the companions were gone. Velrax explained about the dimensional rifts, great tears in the fabric of reality that destroyed everything they touched. The rifts came without warning. They consumed the companion species in a matter of weeks. Velrax survived only because it happened to be in a different part of the dimension when the rifts appeared. It tried to return home, but was caught in a rift that threw it into this reality instead. The dragon arrived in Cravathi space weak and confused. The aliens saw an opportunity and took it. They used technology and psychic conditioning to break Velrax's will, to make it forget what it had been and turn it into what they needed. The process took centuries, but the Cravathi were patient. By the time they finished, Velrax believed it was nothing more than a beast that existed to serve. Katie cried when she heard this story. She hugged the dragon's massive snout and said she was sorry for everything that had happened. Velrax felt her grief and was moved by it. The dragon realized that humans possessed something its original companions had lacked: vulnerability. Humans were fragile and short-lived, and perhaps that made their compassion more precious. They knew suffering in a way that beings of pure energy never could. Jake watched the bond between Katie and Velrax grow stronger each day. He saw how the child changed in the dragon's presence. She smiled more. She seemed less burdened by the trauma of losing her parents. The connection was healing her in ways that normal therapy never could. But he also worried about what would happen when they reached Earth. Katie had become attached to Velrax. If anything forced them apart, it would devastate her. On the 18th day of the journey, the transport's sensors detected something unusual. Several Cravathi military ships were following them at a distance. Jake immediately contacted the throne world and demanded an explanation. The response came from Emperor Korvax himself. The ships were not there to threaten, but to protect. Some military commanders had refused to accept the treaty. They were planning to attack the transport and kill everyone aboard as a way of undermining the Emperor's authority. The escort ships were loyal to the Emperor. They would ensure the transport reached Earth safely. But this incident made clear what Jake and everyone else already suspected. The transformation of the Kravathi Empire would not be peaceful. There would be conflict, potentially violent conflict, between those who accepted change and those who clung to the old ways. Velrax offered to deal with the rebellious commanders personally, but Emperor Korvax declined. This was a Kravathi problem, and the Kravathi needed to solve it themselves. If the Empire could not manage its own internal conflicts without relying on the dragon's power, then the transformation would be meaningless. The dragon accepted this reasoning, though it remained alert for any signs of actual threat. The transport arrived in Earth's orbit on the 21st day. Katie pressed her face against the viewing port and looked at her home planet with eyes that had seen wonders and horrors far beyond what most humans would ever experience. The blue and white marble looked so small and fragile. She wondered if Velrax thought Earth was beautiful, or if the dragon's standards of beauty were too alien for human planets to match. Velrax's thoughts touched her mind gently. The dragon found Earth beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with appearance. This was Katie's home, and therefore it mattered. Beauty was not about aesthetics, but about connection. A place became beautiful when someone you cared about called it home. The landing was scheduled for early morning Arizona time. News crews from every country on Earth gathered at observation points several kilometers from the landing site. Military units stood ready, not to fight but to evacuate civilians if something went wrong. Medical teams prepared for casualties that everyone hoped would not materialize. The whole world watched on screens and waited to see what would happen when a dragon touched down on Earth. The transport descended slowly. Its engines kicked up dust storms that obscured vision for miles around. When the dust finally settled and the landing ramp extended, the cameras caught their first clear view of Velrax emerging into Earth's sunlight. The dragon was even more massive than the broadcasts from the throne world had suggested. Its scales caught the light and reflected it in colors that should not exist. Its wings, folded against its body, still looked large enough to cover a football field. People watching from around the world felt their breath catch. This was a being that could erase their civilization with minimal effort. Every human alive understood instinctively that they were seeing something that could kill them all. The fear was primal and overwhelming. Some people turned off their screens, unable to watch. Others could not look away. Then Katie ran down the ramp behind Velrax, laughing with pure joy. She had not been outside in 3 weeks, and the desert air felt wonderful on her face. She ran to the dragon's side and climbed onto its forearm like it was the most natural thing in the world. The contrast between the cosmic power of the dragon and the innocent trust of the child was stark. It diffused much of the fear gripping humanity. This was not a conqueror arriving to destroy them. This was something far more complex and hopeful. President Clark stood at a podium near the landing site. Her hands shook slightly as she prepared to address the world, but her voice was steady. She spoke honestly about the horror of what almost happened, about the guilt that would never fully leave those who made the decision to send Katie. But she also spoke about redemption, about the possibility of turning tragedy into transformation. She introduced Velrax not as Earth's new master, but as a partner in exploring what humanity might become. Velrax spoke then, its voice translated into every human language simultaneously. The dragon thanked humanity for freeing it, even though that had never been their intention. It explained its desire to live among humans, to learn from them, and perhaps teach in return. It promised to harm no one who did not threaten Katie or the other humans it might bond with in the future. The dragon made clear that it was not here to rule or to judge, but simply to exist alongside humanity as a friend. The world listened to these words and tried to process them. Some people accepted the dragon's assurances immediately. Others remained. The bonding ceremony took place in the Arizona desert where Velrax first landed. It was not a grand event with crowds and cameras. Katie wanted it to be private, witnessed only by the people she trusted most. Jake was there, of course. Dr. Lisa Harper attended, along with President Clark and a few others who had helped Katie through the difficult months after the invasion. Katie wore a simple white dress, not the ceremonial robes of the failed offering, but something clean and comfortable. She walked up to Velrax without hesitation. The dragon lowered its massive head so its eyes were level with hers. They looked at each other for a long moment, human and dragon both understanding what this meant. Katie placed her hand on Velrax's scales. The blue light appeared immediately, but this time it was stronger and more stable. It flowed between them like water finding its level. Katie gasped as memories flooded her mind. 10,000 years of dragon existence poured into her consciousness, carefully filtered by Velrax so she would not be overwhelmed. She saw dimensions beyond human comprehension. She felt the weight of centuries. She understood concepts that should have been beyond her young mind. And Velrax experienced humanity through Katie's perspective. The dragon felt her grief for her lost parents with an intensity that brought tears to the eyes of everyone watching. The dragon saw Earth through her memories, not as a conquered planet but as a home worth protecting. The dragon understood finally and completely why this species out of all the species in the galaxy had managed to break the conditioning that held it captive, because humans knew how to love with a fierceness that transcended logic. They were fragile and short-lived and often foolish, but they could care about things with an intensity that more powerful beings had forgotten was possible. The bonding took several minutes. When it was complete, Katie stumbled backward and Jake caught her. She looked dazed but not hurt. Her eyes had changed slightly. They still looked human, but there was something else there now, a depth that had not existed before. She smiled at the people watching and said she was okay. More than okay. She felt whole for the first time since losing her parents. Velrax made a sound that might have been satisfaction or relief or joy. The dragon's mind touched Katie's constantly now, a background presence that would never fully leave. It was not invasive or controlling, just a gentle awareness. She would always know where the dragon was, how it felt, what it needed, and Velrax would know the same about her. Over the following weeks, Katie discovered what the bond meant in practical terms. She could understand languages she had never studied because Velrax knew them. She could sense danger before it happened because the dragon's awareness extended to her. She healed faster from injuries. She needed less sleep. Her mind worked differently, able to hold complex ideas that would have confused her before. But she was still Katie. She still liked to draw pictures of flowers. She still got upset when other kids were mean. She still missed her parents and sometimes cried about them. The bond enhanced what she was but did not replace who she was. Dr. Lisa Harper studied the bonding carefully. She discovered that several other human children showed signs of being able to bond with Velrax in similar ways. The dragon species was meant to bond with multiple companions, not just one. These children had neural patterns close enough to Katie's that the dragon recognized them as potential partners. Lisa contacted the families of these children and explained the situation. Some were terrified and refused to let their kids anywhere near the dragon. Others were intrigued and agreed to let their children meet Velrax under supervision. Over several months, 3 more children formed bonds with the dragon. They ranged in age from 6 to 12 and each brought different strengths to the connection. A special academy was created for these bonded children. They attended normal school for basic subjects, but they also received training in abilities that no other humans possessed. Velrax taught them how to sense dimensional energy, how to communicate across distances using only thought, how to understand alien species through patterns rather than words. The dragon was patient and gentle with all of them, grateful beyond measure to have companions again after so long alone. Meanwhile, the transformation of the Kravathi Empire continued its difficult progress. The coup attempts eventually failed, but they sparked system-wide conflicts that took years to resolve. Emperor Korvax proved more flexible than anyone expected. He gradually shifted power away from military control and toward governance based on consent. It was messy and incomplete, but it was progress. The ritual of offering children to Velrax was officially abolished across all 300 systems. In its place, the emperor established a memorial fund to honor those who had died in past ceremonies. He began a process of acknowledgement that would take generations to complete. Some species accepted these gestures. Others demanded more concrete reparations. The negotiations were ongoing and often frustrating, but they represented something new, the possibility that wrongs could be addressed rather than simply forgotten. 2 years after Katie bonded with Velrax, Emperor Korvax made a state visit to Earth. It was the first time a Kravathi ruler had visited a subject world as an equal rather than a conqueror. He met with President Clark and Jake, discussing trade agreements and mutual defense pacts. But the most important meeting was between the Emperor and Katie. They talked for several hours in a private garden. Katie, now 9 years old and far wiser than her age suggested, asked about the other species who had lost children to the ritual. She wanted to know if anything could be done to heal that trauma. The Emperor admitted he had no easy answers. Some wounds were too deep for simple apologies to fix, but he promised to try. He established programs to support survivors and families. He opened archives so species could learn the full truth about what had been done in the Empire's name. Before leaving Earth, the Emperor asked Katie if she hated him. She thought about it carefully before answering. She said no, she did not hate him, but she would never forget what almost happened. Memory was important, she explained. It was how people learned from mistakes and avoided repeating them. The Emperor acknowledged the wisdom in her words. He left Earth carrying that lesson with him. 3 years became 5, then 10. Earth continued to grow and change in ways influenced by Velrax's presence. Human scientists made breakthroughs in dimensional physics and energy generation that would have taken centuries without the dragon's guidance. Space travel became faster and safer. Medical treatments improved dramatically as doctors learned from the dragon's understanding of biology. But the changes went deeper than technology. Humanity began to see itself differently. They were no longer alone in the universe, and they were no longer powerless. They had survived conquest and emerged as important players in galactic affairs. This knowledge changed how humans approached problems and how they interacted with other species. Katie grew into a teenager and then a young woman. She remained bonded to Velrax, serving as the primary bridge between human and dragon consciousness. She traveled to other worlds, representing Earth in diplomatic negotiations. She mediated conflicts that threatened to reignite old patterns of conquest. She trained new generations of bonded children who would carry on this work after her. The dragon watched her grow with pride and affection. Velrax had known many beings across countless years, but none had meant as much as this human child who had freed it from captivity without meaning to, who had looked at a monster and seen a friend. Jake lived to see Katie become an adult. He attended her 20th birthday celebration, held in the same Arizona desert where Velrax had first landed. He was older now, his hair gray and his movements slower, but his eyes were clear, and his pride in what Katie had become was obvious to everyone who saw them together. He told her about the journey to the throne world, about watching her walk toward death and feeling helpless to stop it. He confessed the guilt that still woke him some nights, the knowledge that he had participated in choosing a child to die. Katie hugged him and said she understood. She did not blame him or any of the humans who made that choice. They did what they thought they had to do to save their species. Sometimes the worst decisions led to the best outcomes, not because the decisions were right, but because people refused to let them be the final word. Jake died peacefully 2 years later, surrounded by friends and satisfied that he had lived to see humanity find its place among the stars. Katie spoke at his memorial, honoring the man who had escorted a scared 7-year-old to what should have been her death, and instead witnessed the beginning of something unprecedented. The Kravathi Empire continued its transformation over decades. It became less of an empire and more of a commonwealth, with member species having real voices in governance. The change was not complete, and there were still conflicts and injustices, but the trajectory was clear. Fear was no longer the foundation of galactic order. Emperor Korvax eventually died of old age, having ruled longer than any previous emperor. His successor was a younger Kravathi named Calvex, the same advisor who had suggested cooperation rather than force all those years ago. Calvex continued the work of transformation, moving